Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining me, the president of American Commitment, that's americancommitment.org, is Phil Kerpen. And we are going to be talking about school closures bringing the worst of the self-inflicted COVID harm, perhaps economically even worse than the shutdowns themselves. Now, Phil's been talking about this for quite a while, but over the last couple of days, American Federation of Teachers Union President Randi Weingarten has been out there insisting that she was on your side, Phil. That was what you just got done telling me, right?
She's on your side. It's really unbelievable. Ed, I mean, we've been fighting her for 3 years. We fought her tooth and nail. I mean, they were saying, oh, if you open the schools, you're racist and misogynist. I mean, that was the Chicago Teachers Union is a chapter of the American Federation of Teachers. You know, all these local fights we've been having all over the country, a lot of them you're literally fighting her union, okay? And she says we can't possibly open schools until you give us $150 billion. And of course, Biden, oh, here's your $150 billion, all this stuff. And, so we're fighting her tooth and nail. And then she said, no, I've always been for open schools. I was the open schools person. I say, okay.
She is just the worst kind of demagogue. And she's saying, I was always for opening schools. We just needed to get to a point where we could open schools. The problem is that this was a moving target. Every time Randi Weingarten every time she'd make a demand, you'd meet the demand. I think the most interesting of these, you mentioned funding. That was part of it, right? Because they wanted the funding to go in and put barriers up and, plexiglass around student desks, and they got it, right? But the most interesting of these was what Randi Weingarten and other teachers unions insisted that teachers get priority for the vaccine. Do you remember this? This is like early in 2021, right? The teachers had to have priority for the vaccines so that they could be vaccinated ahead of time, and then they could go back into the classrooms. And when that happened, the teachers got vaccinated. Randi Weingarten and the unions then said, yeah, but we can't go in until all the children are vaccinated too.
Right. And of course, and Ed, remember, half the country had been in school that whole school year. It was just the half that were in places that the union didn't have a lot of power. And so, we had all these places that were completely ignoring the things that she was saying and that had been in school, starting in August 2020, basically without incident. And, there was just never in the blue areas, the areas that had huge union influence, nothing would ever be enough. And so they couldn't learn from Europe. They couldn't learn from the southern states. They had their own ideas. And it was always, we need one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. And I really do think it was mostly about money, because remember, when Biden came in, there was a lot of anticipation that, what the unions were doing with the schools was highly political. They were trying to beat Trump. But now that Biden's in, they're going to ease up and everything's going to open. And there's a lot of anticipation around CDC, the first CDC schools guidance under Biden, because almost everyone expected that they would loosen things up and half of the country that hadn't opened would open. And instead, Biden did kind of the opposite. The Biden CDC's first schools guidance actually called for the entire school to close again. And of course, the places that had been ignoring them continued to ignore them. So it didn't actually cause any more closures, but they basically put out this extremely crazy, cancel all sports and extracurriculars anywhere that it's red on this map. And then the whole country was red. I don't know if you remember this. It was like,
I do.
We're in the red zone. You've got to cancel. And it's like, your map has the entire country red. And, it became pretty clear, and a lot of FOIAs came out later, a lot of email traffic and so forth, that the teachers unions actually dictated large sections of that guidance to the CDC. And they didn't relent until Biden passed his CARES Act, which had $150 billion for K-12 education. And it's not, the vast majority of that money was not, for, plexiglass or dumb COVID theater or whatever, because most of the money gets spent out over 10 years. So it wasn't even like the money came in and now we can open it. It's like, no, okay, now we've got the money written into law. So now we can relent. So what I liken this to is basically when Randi says, oh, we were always for opening the schools. We just needed, it to be safe. What she means by that is, we were always going to release the hostages after you paid the ransom. So, we were on your side, right? I mean,
so you probably like David Strom's headline from today too, right? Then, or yesterday, actually, it was up yesterday. Randi Weingarten is an evil liar.
No, I mean, it's if you want to be blunt about it, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Well, David's good at being
she's
blunt.
utterly shameless, utterly shameless. And the other, to go back even further, they had that they clearly had corrupt influence with the Biden CDC, and that extended things another month or two while they were raiding the Treasury for all that money. But that really only impacted the bluest parts of the country because every place else was basically open already at that point. And so
Right.
it's terrible if you were in, New York City or DC or whatever, in California, if you're in a place that cared a lot, then that was terrible that they did that. But I think the union influence on the American Academy of Pediatrics, the prior summer during the Trump administration, was actually even more destructive, was even more corrosive, because not everyone necessarily remembers this, but the first version of the American Academy of Pediatrics schools guidance was really good. The guidance that they put out in late June, it was basically like, everyone should be in school. Don't do a part-time or a hybrid schedule. It's more, if you have less than 6 feet, that's fine. It's better than sitting kids at home. Don't worry too much about masking in the lower grades because they're not going to be able to get any benefit from it anyway. And everyone needs to be in school. Basically what their document said. I mean, it had some silly stuff in there, but it was a pretty good, I mean, it couldn't be characterized as anything but pro-school. And they put that out. And then a few days later, Trump said, look at this. I agree with this. It's great. The pediatricians say all the schools should be open. I want all the schools open. We're going to force them all to open. And a few days after that, 10 days after the original AAP guidance, with only Trump endorsing it in between, they reversed themselves 180 degrees in a literal joint statement with the teachers' unions. And so they put out a press release that said, pediatricians and educators agree that schools can't open until, blah, 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 blah. So they essentially did a total 180-degree reversal. It looked totally political to me, but that was really fateful because in a lot of places, that was kind of like game over, right? Well, hey, pediatricians say we can't open. And so I actually think that their influence on the American Academy of Pediatrics was maybe even more corrosive than their later influence on the CDC, because, of course, when Trump was president, the CDC, at least the CDC director, was great on this issue. I mean, every time Redfield talked about this, he said schools all need to be open. The harms of school closure are much worse. Now, we had a different problem in the Trump administration, which is the bureaucrats were not necessarily on the same page as the director. And so we'd get the director saying all the schools need to be open, and then you go to the website, and like the CDC website at one time had two totally opposite school recommendations on their same website, depending on which page you loaded. So like, there was the one that clearly came from the director. There was like all the schools need to be open, the psychological, mental health harms, all the educational ones, all of that. And then there was like another page somewhere on the CDC site that was like, you can't open unless you can do all these crazy things that no one can do, and unless the case rate is super low and all this kind of thing. So we had a management problem at the CDC during Trump, but at least the leadership was saying the right things. But it really harmed us when the unions flipped to pediatricians. That was a huge setback. And so when she's saying, "Oh no, I was on your side," people were scared. It's like, if people were scared, it's because you got the pediatricians to reverse their position.
Right. On the basis of no science whatsoever. All the science
on the basis of Orange Man bad science.
Well, yeah, okay. On that basis, clearly it was a political move. But I mean, we actually had science coming out of the UK at the time showing that schools were not a amplifier of community transmission.
We had a tremendous amount of science. Look, Sweden never closed schools for under age 16, and they never really imposed any mitigation. They had some guidelines that weren't really followed and that kind of thing, but they never masked. They never really disrupted the schools in any meaningful way. And they had no learning loss, which is probably not surprising, because they were running school normally throughout, but they had no problems related to that. And in fact, Finland, I think, did close schools for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then there was a joint study that came out that summer that basically was done by the health departments in Sweden and Finland. And the Finns said, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have closed at all. The Swedes had it right. There was no benefit of any kind to those closures. And of course, the other European countries, which generally had closures of about 3 or 4 weeks, they did not blow out the whole rest of the school year the way the US did. They produced a huge amount of research and data, and all of it basically showed that schools were a better place for kids to be than not schools, because a school setting is relatively structured. So yeah, it's eventually going to spread through everyone in the school. By the way, 100% of kids ended up getting COVID anyway. By where we are now, it's 95% have antibodies, and the other 5% probably had COVID but just didn't develop antibodies. So we know everyone got it anyway. But look, if you were trying to limit the spread and you were concerned about healthcare resources and that kind of thing, school was still the best place for kids to be, even if that was the only thing you cared about, because it's a structured setting. They're basically in a class with the same kids for the most part. Whereas when schools are closed, everyone's scrambling for different childcare. They're this, that, they're interacting with different people in different ways. The craziest thing was this idea of the part-time hybrid school schedule, where they said, you're going to be in school a few days a week, so you're still going to interact with all the kids that you would have interacted if you were full-time. Right. But, the other couple days, go figure something else out with a different group of people that you're going to interact with. So they significantly increased population mixing because some genius drew on a page. We decided you have to have 6 feet and you can only fit this many desks. It's pretty incredible that they were that they were so, short-sighted.
Completely idiotic. The school closures were disasters, and not just for kids, but for the economy, because it took working people out of the economy because they were forced to care for their children during hours where they would normally be working. And so there was a huge economic hit. In fact, let's talk about all the different ways, because this was really the original topic from your New York Post column. I believe it was about 3 weeks ago or so that you wrote this New York Post column about all the different ways in which this was a disaster. And you can quantify the disaster. You can quantify the cost of the disaster. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a very strong relationship between educational attainment and income, and also between educational attainment and life expectancy, and income and life expectancy. They're all tightly related. And so when you deny kids schooling, and I think on the average is the average kid lost a little bit more than a third of a year of schooling, and of course, there are a lot of kids who didn't lose any, and so you can think about it, the average, there are a lot more that lost a lot more than the average. Right. Kids that lost a full year of educational attainment are a whole grade level behind where they otherwise would have been. And, that has enormous lifetime economic consequences. If they can't figure out a way to catch up, and some kids will catch up, but, a lot will not, that means they're going to have much lower lifetime income. They're going to have lower life expectancy. There's going to be a lot of, costs associated with that, and there have been multiple studies quantifying this. The costs run well into the trillions, and this is it's a hole that we're not necessarily going to get out of, even in the long term, and therefore these consequences are only going to grow over time. And all of the other things that we talked about. I mean, the educational harms are going to have this big economic consequence over time, but of course, we also have enormous mental health harms. We also have enormous physical health harms. There was a lot of weight gain. Childhood obesity went up pretty dramatically over this period. We've got huge increases in anxiety and depression among children during this period. All of that has, economic consequences as well. If somebody's suffering, clinical mental health problems, they're probably not going to be very productive economically. If somebody is suffering obesity, there are a lot of costs associated with that, and healthcare utilization and other things. And so all of the sort of immediate problems, and there are massive ones, they all have downstream consequences. Ultimately, I think the worst is going to be that loss of educational attainment. I mean, the difference in life expectancy between a high school graduate and a high school dropout is about 5 years. And so if we've got 500,000 or 1 million kids who would have finished high school and now didn't because they fell off the map or they started doing something else or what have you, that's going to have a massive economic and health consequence over time. And so, yeah, and the thing that's crazy about it is, as I said, there was no benefit to any of it. Every kid ended up getting COVID anyway. And so what do we do this for? It was literally all pain with no gain. And so that's why I say it was the worst self-imposed harm. And it actually might ultimately prove worse even than the natural harms of COVID itself. And, that would obviously be a stronger claim given, the number of people that died from COVID. But in the long term, that may in fact prove to be the case. And so I think it was just the catastrophic self-imposed error, policy error that we had, the school closures that we did, and that they lasted as long as they did. And the other aspect of this, there's a recent thing, the Associated Press did this study with Stanford. I don't know if you saw this, but they sort of looked at the enrollment drops in public schools across the country, the known increases in enrollment in private schools, the known increases in homeschooling, and they figured out that there are about 250,000 kids that are completely missing. We don't know where they are. They're not in the public schools anymore. They're not in the private schools. They're not being homeschooled. Their whereabouts are unknown and unaccounted for. And that's pretty scary, because they're going to start showing up in ways that, committing crimes or, drugs or whatever. I mean, they're going to start, when that many kids drop off the radar, they're going to start to reappear in ways that are disturbing. And we've already seen it to a certain extent.
And socially costly, and not just in terms of crime, but in terms of, requirement for, safety net program support. That's that type of thing. People who are just simply, you hate to, it's a bit reductive to say, well, they're not going to be productive members of society, because obviously, people's lives matter more than just simply what they produce. But when you're talking about calculating public policy, when you're talking about calculating the types of safety net programs that we do have in place and what resources are going to be required, you do have to talk about whether people are self-sufficient or not going to be self-sufficient. And the odds of the people who are dropping off the radar somehow achieving self-sufficiency in a meaningful way are a lot longer than people who were able to get through this without going through the closures, without going through the developmental loss, the educational loss, the socialization loss. And I think if you're a child whose normal experience is homeschooling, you're not going to have these types of outcomes, but from staying home, right? But if your normal had been being in public schools or even in private schools, and suddenly you're thrown into a sort of quasi homeschooling situation where it's not really homeschooling, it's really just being on a computer and looking at Zoom. Man, I think that's really dislocating. And I mean, it kind of puts you in the worst of all worlds. You're going to fall behind people who are homeschooled, where outcomes are usually really good, both in terms of, capabilities and in terms of, mental, being well adjusted mentally and emotionally, that type of thing. But you're also going to be behind the people in public and private schools now too, who were able to go all the way through. And the outcomes here are going to be, it's going to be difficult, I think, to actually measure this as we go along. And it's going to occupy it's going to be the sociologist perpetual employment, syndrome, I guess you could say. They're going to
be a lot of studies on this, I think. And look, I mean, I don't want to be too fatalistic about it, Ed, because I do think that we can catch a lot of kids up. We can reverse a lot of these harms to a certain extent. Yes. But the thing, what I think is happening now, though, is the kids who are in stable situations, middle or upper income, they are largely being caught up. Okay, some of the developmental and social is more difficult, but certainly in terms of the educational, the things that you can solve with resources, those kids mostly will catch up. Now, a lot of other kids, though, are in less stable home situations or have dropped off the radar completely. And it's who's going to help them catch up? And this idea, what do you get from the left and the people who impose this on us in the unions? They say just throw more money at them and they'll solve the problem. Well, I don't think so. I don't think that'll solve the problem very well at all. And so I do worry that the kids who have disappeared, I don't know how you make them reappear in a way that's positive. And so it's a challenge. Even if we all agree we should address it, it's not really clear that it can be fixed, or certainly that it can be fixed for everyone at this point.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think that the idea that Randi Weingarten is now trying to change history and trying to recast herself as an advocate for open schools gives you an idea of just how bad this is going to end up looking when people really.
Well, even Fauci did the same thing. He said, "Oh no, I always wanted the school." I mean, and what they did. The thing is, if somebody doesn't have kids and didn't really pay close attention, then they could almost get away with these lies, because back in 2020 and 2021, they did always say things like, "Oh, I want the schools open," but there's always a but, right? And they say, "But it has to be safe. You have to do this, this." So now they pull these clips and they say, Fauci's like, "Hey, look, here are 10 times I said I want the schools open." It's like, okay, but we were paying attention to,
Yeah, you have to not that he's a great philosopher or anything, but you have to quote Pee Wee Herman on this. And I'm going to play Stump Phil here.
I know you are, but what am I?
Pee Wee's Great Adventure is, but everybody always has a big butt. So please tell me, what was your big butt? What's your big butt? I don't know if you remember that from Pee Wee's Big Adventure. He's talking to somebody who says, "Oh, I always wanted to visit Europe," and it's just whatever, Paris. I think it was supposed to be Paris, and he talks about everybody's big butt, which is hilarious, but it really applies in this because they were laying the groundwork for these are weasel words, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I here's 10 times I said I want schools open, but they don't want to talk about their big butt.
Right.
I mean, I don't know a better way to put that,
it's really infuriating to see the people that we fought against tooth and nail day after day after day now claiming that, oh no, actually we were the good guys, and not like we were the good guys because we were right and you were wrong. They're pretending they were saying the things we were saying.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think an apology is really worth a hell of a lot, but at least they should acknowledge the fact that they were wrong. And it's not like there wasn't data on this because, as you said, in a lot of states, these schools were already open, they were operating, and there weren't any disastrous outcomes in terms of COVID-19, community transmission.
Right. Yeah, they ignored the data from Europe, and then they ignored the data from the South. It's like no data from other places can have bearing on blue state, blue city America. Was basically what they were saying.
It's crazy. Just absolutely crazy. All right. So Phil Kerpen, you're president of American Commitment, AmericanCommitment.org. Go over there. You can take a look at how you can contribute, obviously. But what else are you working on? Just briefly, what else are you working on over at American Commitment?
Well, we supported the House debt ceiling bill, which I thought was a really good bill this past week. So that was kind of our big push that got through, and we're going to try to buck up Republicans to really fight for the things that they put in that bill. And at some point, I think that the president will probably have to negotiate, and we're going to try to get some policies that actually change the trajectory of the country in terms of growth and spending restraint. If we're going to have to pile on more debt on the national debt, which looks obviously unavoidable at this point. So that was kind of the big one this week. But we're still trying to stop the student loan bailouts, and we're still trying to push some more sensible energy policy and some of these other things. And of course on the COVID front, we're still trying to get rid of the ban on unvaccinated foreign travelers. We hope in time for the U.S. Open so that Djokovic can play. So that's another one. There are like 6 countries left in the world, and we're one of them. It's like us, Pakistan, and Indonesia, and then a handful of island countries. So it's
even though we have all sorts of data right now that says that the vaccine doesn't actually stop transmission. It actually doesn't stop.
They don't care. It's a ridiculous policy. There's no defense for it, but Biden hasn't dropped it. So until he does, we'll keep banging that drum too.
It's because power is all that matters. Power is all that matters. Also, there's a essay up right now called End Regulatory Tyranny, Don't Expand the Power of the Federal Trade Commission. Maybe we'll have you back on to talk about that sometime.
Be happy to, because Lena Khan, who runs that agency, is one of the craziest leftists who's ever been given power in this country. And unfortunately, there are a lot of bills in Congress to give her more power, including some that Republicans support, because they haven't necessarily thought through. They say, I hate this company, I'm going to stick the FTC on them. And it's like, well, it's like this FTC? It's like,
yeah, well, go over to AmericanCommitment.org and check that out. We'll get Phil back on here soon to talk more about that. Phil Kerpen, at Kerpen, Kerpen on Twitter. Still on Twitter?
Yep, that's it. Last name.
There you go, at Kerpen. So be sure to check that out as well. Thanks, Phil. Great talking with you again.
All right, have a good one.